Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. For today's event, Is Education Worth It? I'd like to welcome you to today's debate between two extremely capable debaters, Dr. Bryan Caplan and Dr. Eric Hanushek, who I will introduce in detail in a moment. Today's agenda is pretty straightforward. I'll give some opening remarks and then sort of explain how the debate will work. Following that, each of our two debaters will come up for 10-minute opening statements to give you their argument. Then we'll all join in the middle here for a few minutes of question and answer, led by me, and debate back and forth. Following that, we'll have a second vote. The first vote we'll do in just a moment on the motion, and whoever shifts your opinion the furthest in their direction will win the debate. And after that, we will adjourn. Today, Bryan and Eric will debate whether the education system we have is a waste of time and money. And you'll have a chance, of course, to weigh in on the motion to determine the winner. The U.S. spends over $12,000 a year per public K-12 student and over $150 billion in federal aid to post-secondary students. We're approaching $1 trillion annually. And many argue frequently and loudly that this is still not enough to ensure high-quality education for all students. Economics professor Bryan Caplan argues just the opposite in his latest book, The Case Against Education. My dog-eared copy is right here, claiming that education is a waste of time and money, primarily serving as a credentialing institution that doesn't add too much value. Rick Hanushek, on the other hand, argues that schooling does more than signaling students' intelligence or work ethic, but provides valuable skills and training, and in turn raises society's overall productivity. So does education enhance students' knowledge or skills efficiently? Or does it mostly signal their intelligence, work ethic, and conformity, the qualities of good employees? In other words, is the education system a waste of time and money? That's the motion that we will debate today. And I'll leave it to Bryan or Eric, to try and convince you either way. But first, let me explain about how today's event will work. Before it starts, you, the audience members, both in person and online, will have a chance to weigh in on the motion. Is the education system a waste of time and money? I'll explain more on that in a moment. And then Bryan will kick off the debate with his opening 10-minute statement here from the podium, followed by Rick. Then again, I'll lead some Q&A in the middle and ask some questions and allow Bryan and Eric to openly talk across on issues for a vigorous debate. And then we'll close things out with brief closing statements, final pitches for whether or not education system is a waste of time and money. And then we'll vote finally on the motion. And your votes will determine who's the winner. So let's talk specifically about how to do the voting. Audience participation is requested. Some of our housekeeping, we usually say, please turn off your cell phones. But no, we do not want you to do that today. We want you to silence your cell phones, but have them out because we're going to use them to do the votes. The pre-debate poll, for those attending in person, we want you to follow the instructions on the piece of paper that was at your seat when you came in. And you can submit your personal response, whether you agree with the motion, disagree with the motion, or are undecided. Again, the motion is the education system is a waste of time and money. If you do not have your instructions, raise your hand and someone will come by to give you them. For those watching online, please go to slido.com, that's SLIDO.com, and enter the code AEI online. And please submit your answer there. Again, that code is AEI online. To calculate the winner of the debate later, we will use the results from our in-person audience, but we want both audiences to vote at both times. Please start now. You have 3 minutes from right now to submit your initial response. While you're waiting, I'll ask our two debaters to come up and take the stage. Bryan Caplan and Eric Hanushek. Eric, who is on the right here, is the John H. Macon Visiting Scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on the economic analysis of educational issues. His previous work includes how to measure teacher quality through student achievement and how to measure the quality of education and how it's closely related to the national economic growth. He's concurrently the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Highlights of Dr. Hanushek's extensive career in both the academic world and government services include being a commissioner and consultant at the U.S. Department of Education, a consultant at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, a deputy director of the Congressional Budget Office, and outside of government, he served as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a consultant to the World Bank. He was also the chairman of the Economics Department and the founding director of the W. Allen Wallace Institute of Political Economy at the University of Rochester. He's the author, editor, and co-editor of 24 books, including recently Endangering Prosperity, A Global View of the American High School. He's testified before Congress in various school finance cases and has been widely published in academic journals and popular outlets. A distinguished graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, Dr. Hanushek completed his PhD in economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Please welcome Dr. Hanushek. Dr. Bryan Caplan, who again is the author of the book that we're centering today's debate on, The Case Against Education, is a professor of economics at George Mason University and a blogger for EconLog. He's the author of The Case Against Education, as we've said, also Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, Why Being a Great Parent is Less Work and More Fun Than You Might Think, and The Myth of the Rational Voter, Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies, named the best political book of the year by the New York Times. He's currently collaborating with Saturday morning breakfast serials Zach Weinersmith on All Roads Lead to Open Borders, a nonfiction graphic novel on the philosophy and social science of immigration, and another new book, Poverty, Who to Blame. He's been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, American Economic Review, and the list goes on and on. He's also been featured on ABC, Fox News, MSNBC, and C-SPAN. Dr. Caplan earned his BA in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD from Princeton. Please welcome Bryan Caplan. I am now going to officially lock down the voting for the initial round. You will learn those results at the end of the debate. Right now, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Bryan Caplan.
Thank you very much. So, is the education system really a waste of time and money, as my new book claims right on the cover? This is a strange topic to debate with Eric Hanushek. Why? Because if Hanushek had absolute power to fix the education system, education might actually be worth every penny. Right? Hanushek is famous for focusing on what schools teach rather than what they spend, and documenting the vast disconnect between the two. If you haven't already read his dissection of input-based education policies, you really ought to. Hanushek, more than any other economist alive, has taught us that measured literacy and numeracy are socially valuable, but just making kids spend long years in well-funded schools is not. Tragically, however, Hanushek is not our education czar. Instead, all levels of our education system are extremely wasteful and ineffective. After spending more than a decade in class and burning up over $100,000 in taxpayer money, most Americans know shockingly little. About a third of adults are more or less illiterate and innumerate. Average adult knowledge of the other standard academic subjects, history, social studies, science, foreign languages, is near zero. The average adult with a BA has roughly the knowledge base that you would intuitively attribute to a high school or to a high school graduate, and the average high school graduate has basically the knowledge base that you would intuitively attribute to a high school dropout. This is the fruit of $1 trillion of taxpayer money per year. Now, for economists, there is a very powerful objection to everything I've just been telling you. If students really learn so little, why on earth is education so lucrative in the labor market? Why do high school grads out-earn dropouts by 30%? Why do college grads out-earn high school grads by 73%? Explain that. Employers want profit, and they aren't dumb. They wouldn't pay exorbitant premia unless education dramatically improved worker productivity, right? Wrong. There are two solid business reasons to pay extra for educated workers. One is that education teaches useful skills, transforming unskilled students into skilled workers. This is the standard human capital theory that gets taught in classrooms all the time. The other reason, though, is that education certifies useful skills, helping employers distinguish skilled workers from imposters. This is the signaling story. In the real world, naturally, it is a continuum. I have never said it's all signaling, even though people keep putting that sentence into my mouth. It is not all signaling. But since Hanushek is not our education czar, signaling does explain most of education's financial reward. Now, how in the world can we know this? We should just start with a massive gap between learning and earning, combined with the fact that even the most irrelevant subjects and even the most irrelevant majors actually earn decent financial rewards. If human capital were the whole story, why on earth would employers care about whether you've studied Shakespeare or Latin or trigonometry? Now think about all the classroom materials that you haven't used since the final exam. If that doesn't fully convince you, there's many other facts that every student knows that cut in the same direction, such as, first, it is easy to unofficially attend college classes without enrolling or paying tuition, but almost no one bothers. Right? The best education in the world is free. Just go. No one's going to check your ID. All you want to learn, all you want to do is learn. You can do it already. But there's just one thing that you won't have at the end of 4 years of guerrilla education, and that's the diploma, which is, of course, the central signal of our whole society. A second sign of signaling. Just students focus on grades over learning, which is best seen in students' tireless search for easy A's. Right? Now, signaling is a simple explanation. So a professor gives you a high grade in exchange for minimal work. You get that nice seal of approval, the stamp on your forehead, without having to suffer for it. Third sign. Students routinely cram for final exams, then calmly forget almost everything they've learned. Signaling provides a clean explanation. Learning and then forgetting still impresses employers. Failing does not. Now, in the case against education, I also go over multiple major bodies of academic research to try to help pin down the exact human capital signaling breakdown. In the end, my best estimate is that signaling is 80% of the payoff. Here are some of the key pieces of evidence. First of all, most of the payoff for education comes from graduation, not mere years of education. This is a doozy for human capital theory to explain. I mean, do you really think that schools withhold all the useful skills until senior year and then they finally crack open the chest and give them to you? Doesn't make sense. But it makes perfect sense if graduation is the focal signal of conformity to social norms. It says, look, I'm willing to do what every parent, teacher, and peer says I'm supposed to do. All right. Second piece of empirical evidence. There's been massive credential inflation since 1940. The education that you need to actually do a given job has not changed very much. But the education that you need to get a job has gone up by about 3 years since that time. Hence the fact that now a waiter, bartender, security guard, and cashier are common jobs for college graduates. Third sign. Though every data set does yield different estimates, the effect of national education on national income is much smaller than the effect of personal education on personal income. Again, how is this possible? Signaling, right? So if you give everyone more useful skills, then the whole nation gets richer. But if you give everyone a ton of stamps on their forehead, that doesn't enrich the nation, right? Instead, you just fritter away valuable student time and tax money. Now, if you've been wondering what in the world does all this signaling stuff have to do with wasteful education, I hope you are starting to see the link. Sure, it is useful to rank workers, but once students have already been ranked, prolonging the ranking game is a socially destructive rat race. When education levels skyrocket, the main result isn't good jobs for everyone. Instead, the main result is credential inflation. The more education the average worker has, the more education the average worker needs to be employable. And while sending fancy signals is a great way for any one of you to get a great job, it is not a path to a wealthy society. Now, given Hanushek's work, I'm actually optimistic that he's going to agree with a lot of what I've said. It's our remedies that starkly diverge. So my primary solution for all these ills is cutting education spending. In a word, austerity. Austerity, it's a word I love. It's a word I believe in. If Hanushek's bleak assessment of input-based education policies is right. Austerity will save us tons of time and money with very little effect on worker skill. Strangely, though, my opponent does not seem to be excited by this glorious free lunch. His primary solution for what ails us, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure you will, is to take the money that we currently waste and use it to increase measured learning, especially of math and science. I disagree on both strategic and fundamental grounds. All right, strategically, spending less is easy and transparent. We totally know how to spend less money. Any dummy can spend less money. Right? Spending more effectively, in contrast, is hard and foggy. Right? And to make the improvements in the quality of education actually happen, we have to trust the very education system that spent decades ripping off taxpayers and wasting students' time. Now, my fundamental disagreement with Rick. While I agree that measured learning is much more socially valuable than mere years in school, his enormous estimates of the benefits of higher test scores really are just too good to be true. Right? I do encourage you to read his work because what he's saying is, if he's right, it's one of the most important things. But, in his view, a higher average math and science scores not only dramatically increase our wealth, but they actually permanently raise the economy's rate of growth. So it's like a perpetual motion machine. But here's my reply. How can this be true when the typical worker uses very little math and almost no science on the job? The simplest explanation for Hanushek's results is that national test scores are misleading proxies for a much more crucial and far less malleable trait, intelligence. If everyone were smarter, we would all do our jobs better. But if everyone knew more science, most of us would rarely encounter the opportunity to use our extra knowledge. I use my intelligence on the job every day. We all use our intelligence on the job every day. But whole months go by when I don't use biology or chemistry or physics. So in sum, if I had to hand over $1 trillion to one stellar researcher, I'd be sorely tempted to hand it to my opponent, Eric Hanushek. A few educational experiments would be more exciting to watch. Nevertheless, I predict that the results of the experiment would be very disappointing. Entrenched interests and legions of touchy-feely parents would block him at every turn. Czar Hanushek would not be allowed to actually do what he wants to do. And if you start talking about test scores, I know what they would say because I've heard my fellow parents say it. Test scores, that's so narrow and boring. Let's have more poster projects, more art, more drawing. Ugh. Right. And even if Czar Hanushek managed to sharply boost math and science scores, I'd expect only a modest social payoff. Once we admit the massive defects of the status quo, the only remedy we can really count on is austerity. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I was going to accept the czardom immediately, and then I thought that the last czar of Russia was executed. And so I'm a little bit worried about accepting this. Let me go through what my view of this world is, and then we'll have a chance to have a dialogue on this. So the overview is that is signaling versus human capital 2080 or 80-20? And it's obvious Caplan has gone for 2080 and I'll go for 80-20, that both there is a continuum, but that it's the majority of it is getting skills. I don't have the advantage of riding two popular waves. There's the wave of people who think that talk of career and college ready means everybody should go to college, and then there's a backlash to that. So Caplan has caught that backlash. And he's also caught the Trump wave of let's have more vocational education, which he didn't emphasize, so that you can envision him as surfing along on these popular waves. Now, there are some things that we do agree upon. We agree that there's much inefficiency in schools. I've made part of my career on that argument, but that's something different than saying all schooling is signaling to admit to inefficiency. I think for very different reasons that you should in fact cut the subsidies to public higher education by a fair amount, but it's different than his reasons. I think it's distributional. And we can all agree that we've had a variety of courses where we learn very little by our own assessment. Places where we disagree are, his book suggests that human capital means that if you get more years of schooling, everything is good, and that it's all in years of schooling. But that's a crummy measure of the skills and human capital of people. It not only ignores any versions of quality of schooling, but it also ignores the effects of parents and other inputs to human capital. He also thinks that we just cut back everybody and make more vocational education there, which is implicitly an argument that we can predict where people will work in the future and that we can do that well and that it won't affect the economy. And he likes early tracking, which I do not, and an argument that schooling just provides minimal skills. Well, let me talk about his evidence and how I see the evidence. There are two ways that you can argue signaling versus human capital. The difference is what happens in schools, not in the labor market, because in both models, people with the same amount of schooling get the same wage. It's whether you learned anything in school or not. So you can argue, as he does, by making fun of the fact that nobody has ever used the Pythagorean theorem in their job. And so therefore we shouldn't teach any of that. Or you can argue, as he did, about the sheepskin effect, that there's a big boost from getting the diploma or sheepskin. So the first thing I did was to actually just go to US data, because I thought, I haven't followed this literature very closely, but I thought that there was a lot of disagreement about whether there were sheepskin effects or not. So I just went to the US Census data, the American Community Survey, downloaded 3 million data points on people's earnings and their schooling and experience, and estimated what I think is the Caplan model. And it goes like this. If I estimate the effect of a year of schooling, I get that there's a 17% wage increase for each year of schooling in the census data. If I look at whether they graduate, for that last year, according to the ACS, they get 17% plus an additional 5% or 22%. Bump for the last year, but not an overwhelming bump. And if I look at all the other degrees, diplomas that are strung out in the ACS, the GED is a negative. For an AA degree in community college, you get 3%. For a BA, you get 1%. Lose 10% for a master's degree, and lose 39% for a doctorate. Now, this is not that your income goes down. It's that you don't get the full 17%, and that's how much less you get for these. Now, just to be clear, this is not anything to do with the sample of all the population. If I do this for white males and white females, males are blue striped and females are green dotted, you get the same answer by stratifying by race or gender. But if I go to the Caplan numbers, the black lines are the Caplan numbers that you get. First, he combines all of the advanced degrees into one category, and he gets 18% for that. But what you get here is that the value of a year of schooling drops dramatically in his estimates. It increases dramatically for a high school diploma from 5% to 32% for that diploma. Similarly, for AA degrees from 3 to 17%. And I think it's all that he has used this what I think is a peculiar data set called the General Social, I couldn't remember what the second S was, Social Survey, and gets very different estimates than I get for the 3 million people that are kicking around in the ACS. Now, the other thing that I did when I had these data was to plot out the distribution of income for somebody who has a high school degree and somebody who has a college degree. And his story would be that there's a tight little narrow normal distribution of high school people and there's a tight little normal distribution of college people and they don't overlap very much. And that there's sort of these two nipples sitting up with no overlap. But in fact, when you plot these out, you find that there's a huge overlap. The dark line is the distribution of wages and salaries for high school graduates. The dotted line is college graduates. If you used income instead of wages and salaries, you get the same answer. And how much overlap is there? Well, one way to look at this is I have the high school graduate distribution, and I look at the college median, and there's 21% of the high school graduates, 4 years less schooling, that are earning more than the college graduates. Similarly, if I look at the college graduates and look at the high school median there's 23% of the college graduates that are earning less than the median college graduate. Now, what I interpret this as is that there are very different skills of people with these different schooling levels, and in fact, they get paid off in the labor market. Now, the economic evidence on the economic payoffs, reasons to believe that this distribution reflects skill variations, is that there's lots of studies that show that there's a high return to measured cognitive skills, just the measured part. There's obviously more broader skills than that, but the measured cognitive skills have a large impact in on the labor market and earnings of individuals. He says he doesn't believe it because the estimates are too good, but it turns out that I would say that cognitive skills across nations have a big impact on growth rates. They explain 75% of the country-level differences in economic growth rate, long-run growth rate, by the skills of the population. In particular, a country's growth rate is dependent upon the skills of the people. And then thirdly, in terms of adjusting to economic conditions, we find that countries that have higher growth rate have higher returns to individual skills. In other words, people with more skills get paid more in countries where the change in the economy, the change in the way things are done that comes with economic growth are higher. Now, I think that the Caplan answer to this would be that, yeah, there's some skill differences, but there are things that I call ability or IQ throughout the book. And I think there are reasons to believe that the schools have a dramatic and clear effect on the measured skills that we have that were important before. First, we have various value-added estimates of the contribution of different teachers to learning, and we see that there are very different effects. Secondly, we know that the effects of having a better teacher early in school show up in later income from the Chetty work, and so that these are real effects that we see that show up. Thirdly, if you believe the sort of IQ story, you have to believe the following. If we compare Massachusetts to Mississippi, an 8th grader in Mississippi, by conventional estimates of the difference in achievement, would be about the middle 5th grader in Massachusetts. Is that all IQ differences of people in Mississippi? Now, we're on the East Coast, and so it's common to think that maybe that's it. But if I go further, the average 9th grader in the US is like a middle 6th grader in Singapore. You want to believe that that's all IQ differences and not differences in what they are getting from in terms of skill development and in particular in terms of schools. Now, oops, it did something that I didn't expect it to do. So I'll just add a few other comments since I think I'm out of time. I don't know if I am. That we can pick up. Sort of this idea that you can link individual homework problems to skills on the job and that's evidence on this just strikes me as overwhelming. I can't imagine that that's the right way to think about this, as opposed to the general cognitive skills and analytical power that people get from sitting through some completely irrelevant classes that teach you a little bit about how to do this analysis. Now, the answer that he would give was that psychologists show that there's no transfer, but I think that that's kind of crazy. And that the value of a course is equal to the proportion of facts that you remember at the end. That also strikes me as kind of hard to believe. And then the final part that we didn't, that he didn't discuss in his comments that are in throughout the book, or the ending answer is, well, cut back on all this general education and a lot more vocational education. Because we know there's good jobs for plumbers and electricians, and we should just train people for that early on, starting with 6th grade as opposed to the 4th grade in Germany, which I think is bad policy.
All right. Well, I have told both Bryan and Rick that I want to hear more of them and less of me. So I'm going to just try and open up with a few framing comments. Feel free to respond to one another. The first one that I just want to draw our attention to is what Rick, you already said. It's a question of balance here. You both believe there are signaling, that the signals are not a pure reflection of the human capital gains that students get per year of education. You say it's 20-80, and you say it's 80-20. Okay. My question is that if it were, if these were both perfectly in balance, then we would have signals from credentials that would be a perfect indicator of what students learn. And so it seems to me, Bryan, that your argument is that kids really don't learn much at all from school. They just don't get much. So my question is, how do we know how much kids learn in school and how valuable it is? It seems to me it's a key assertion. It's a jump ball.
All right, so I say that the best way to find out what people really learn is to test adults, because of course a lot of people know stuff on the day of the final exam, but they forget it. So the best data here, there's something called the National Assessment of Adult Literacy that goes to randomly selected American adults and tests their literacy and numeracy. And, like the result from that is, about a third of Americans are close to illiterate and numerate despite spending many years in school. And then I say for all the other school subjects that we can think about, where we've got measures of what adults actually know, it is a homeopathic dose of knowledge. My favorite factoid here is if you ask Americans, remember that you're asking them to assess themselves whether they learned to speak a foreign language very well in school, under 1% even claim this occurred. And yet, in order to go and get those diplomas, you need 2 or 3 years of study for a level of language knowledge, which is, even according to the people themselves, next to nothing. So, the general approach of actually measuring learning, I think this is great. I think that it's better to go and measure what adults actually retain rather than just what people knew on the day of the final exam, because of course what matters on the job is what you know when you're there, not what you used to know.
When you go to the adult surveys, of which the most recent one called PIAC, the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, people were tested in their math and literacy. And it turns out that a standard deviation higher in numeracy skills translates in the US into 28% higher income across your lifetime. So that we know that the skills pay off, and the only question in the signaling and human capital debate is where did these skills come from? And it's hard to go to old people and ask them, what was that course you took and what did you get out of that course that you're using today? I think that's the wrong way to do it. If you want to know what people learned in school, you can test and find out that they learned varying amounts. The fact that it's inefficient does not mean that it's all signaling. It means that there's room for improvement, and I accept the role as czar.
Bryan, one of the most, I think, potent word-for-word lines that you have in the book is, if you want to find out how powerful signaling is, answer this question. Would you rather have a Princeton education without a Princeton diploma, or a Princeton diploma without a Princeton education? It's a pretty good question. Eric, this is a powerful statement. Does it not support his motion, or is it a distractor?
So buried down the footnotes, degree levels provide a first indication to employers of the potential skills that somebody has. And they're useful information that employers tend to use all the time because they can be put put easily on a resume, and after Griggs versus Duke Power, it's pretty hard to test people and find out what their cognitive skills are in any way because of potential discrimination. What you see, and we dispute this, is that people who have looked at this, only a few, find that the value of skills increases with time with the employer and the value of a degree decreases with time with an employer. In other words, employers are learning over time. Bryan would argue that 10 years is too long to wait for employers to come on, and then he flips back into an argument that I think is completely irrelevant. And the irrelevant argument is that nobody likes to fire people, so that even if you find out that people are different skills, nobody wants to fire them. But that has nothing to do with signaling. It has to do with inefficiencies in the labor market.
Great point about what the argument is, but let me explain why it's actually a very totally on point argument. So I've had a lot of economists, beginning with Gary Becker, saying, look, signaling can't be important because after you get hired, within 3 months, employers know whether you're good or not, and if it turns out that you're not as good as your credentials say, they will flush you, right? And when people said this, that sounds like a very harsh regime. I don't know of any employers that actually work this way, so I went and read into sociology. How does firing actually work? It's very normal, actually, for employers, once they hire you, to keep you on even if they are pretty disappointed and maybe wait for the next recession before they actually get rid of you. Now, what's the connection with signaling? Well, if you are willing to fire someone the second you think they're not good, then it's okay to give people chances and who don't have the right credentials, and you say, well, like, you didn't work out, fine. On the other hand, if you know that you're going to feel emotionally stuck with the worker if you give them a chance, you don't want to take a lot of chances. You want to go and make sure that the person has the right credentials so that you have a pretty good knowledge that they're actually going to work out. So again, this talking about why employers don't like firing is the crucial answer to people who say signaling just can't matter a priori because employers would just fire you if you weren't any good.
So I have a question on the slides that Rick put up. He used ACS data, you use GSS data. I want to give you the opportunity just to point out anything about that, but also, some of the most provocative slides on there are his distributions with the medians of high school versus college earnings. How do you respond to those?
Yeah, I'd say, look, education is one of the many things that has an effect on earnings. There's tons of other stuff that matters that we're not measuring, so it's not surprising that there's a big distribution. Right? There are plenty of people who finish college and then they decide they don't even want to work. So, right? Or they're going to focus on other things in their life. So it's not surprising that there's a distribution. In terms of the data on the sheepskin effect, I'll say there I was blindsided. Regressions from Eric Hanushek, which I always take seriously. So I don't have the data with me right now. Here's what I can say. Where did my numbers come from? So it's true that I did talk about the General Social Survey, which I would say is not a weird survey. I'd say it's one of the most amazing surveys ever done because for the sheer diversity of questions. But anyway, that's only one example of a data set that I use. And then if you go into the footnotes, I actually go and track down every single paper that was published on the sheepskin effect. Every single paper on the extra return that you get from graduation as opposed to mere years. And I actually have two separate tables. There's one table where I look at the estimates that you get if you just assume that years 12 and 16 are graduation years. And those give much bigger sheepskin effects than what Rick showed. I don't know how his numbers are so low, but I can just say, go and turn to the footnotes. But then there's another set of studies that don't just assume that years 12 and 16 are graduation years. Instead, they have explicit degree measures. Because sometimes people actually do 17 years and then they graduate, for example. Or they may graduate early. They may manage to graduate high school after 11 years. So the studies that measure degrees explicitly, where they actually know both your years and your degrees, these are the ones that get really big sheepskin effects. And again, I say these are the ones that are actually using the right measure. They're not just assuming that you got a degree in year 16, they actually check. So again, I basically, I think you've got a paper right there because you have a result on the sheepskin effect that is way smaller than any other published paper in the last 25 years.
Data are on the web.
So I'll ask a slightly different question, but similar to my earlier one. The argument that signaling is so powerful partially depends on the idea that education does not provide the human capital that we think it is. So my question is, does schooling provide the minimal school skills that we want it to provide to most students? And as an extra question, would it be possible for them to get it if we went into education austerity?
Yes. So second question, would it be possible? Of course it would be possible. There's tons of other ways that you can learn it. Or, of course, you could go and learn it during the time allotted instead of stretching it out to so long. In terms of, like, does school deliver the minimal skills? I guess it depends upon how minimal you make them. Like the main thing out of these assessments of adult literacy and numeracy, and something like a third of adult Americans are at least close to functionally illiterate and numerate. The questions they can't answer, like just adding up a few items from a receipt. Right? It is stunning. And again, you probably don't know anyone whose skills are this poor, but they also did 10 or 12 years of public education. So this is the fruit for many people. The other 2/3, I guess they're getting the minimum. But say, why is it that you should settle for the minimum when you're charging so much per year and the school goes on for so many years? Why can't you actually get kids getting up to be literate and numerate in 8 years? What's so hard about that?
I'll turn this same question to you, Rick. I mean, there must be an easier way. If we starved the beast, wouldn't kids become educated adults by some other mechanism?
We could in fact invent the world at the beginning of the 19th century and have a lot of people that are at the very minimum of skills, but are in fact our economy and the world around us is affected by improvements in productivity and economic growth. And these, I think, depend upon having a cumulative education that in fact provides people with the skills to invent new things and to increase productivity. And I don't see how cutting back to ensuring that everybody had minimum skills, which we didn't do with No Child Left Behind, but if we cut back to that, that we would necessarily have the same future, economic future. This is partly the question, can you identify the few Bryan Caplans who we give all of the intermediate microeconomic instruction classes to, and then everybody else does something else, and do we get the right person doing that? And I don't think that that's the right kind of world. And what stuns me, I should say, Brian, I've never heard a libertarian argue the socialist Soviet position like this with quite such strength of we'll get people into their right jobs and we'll start in 6th grade and we'll get them all into the right economic education career path that will in fact give us growth in all of the sectors that we know we need people in.
I didn't know that cutting government spending on education was a Soviet position, but...
But it's the second part that has to do of getting people, the right people educated, so that you admit in the book that there are a few people that have STEM skills that are in engineering that are kind of useful, which I think that there are. And it's how do you cut back in general and get the same people or equal people into those skills.
Right, I mean, so the current system basically is everybody gets a chance to go to college and then we find out whether you're a future Einstein. Like, why is that the magic cutoff? Why not go and see, look, we can get a lot of information about whether you're going to succeed in college when you're in high school. We can get a lot of information about whether you're going to succeed in high school when you're in junior high. So again, it's one thing to say we have an absolutely rigid system where if you don't make the cutoff, that's it for you and you're a plumber. But to have a system where at least you go and encourage people to go and say, look, like, it doesn't seem very likely this is going to work out for you. If you want to try it, I guess you can, but you don't even seem to like school very much. Why don't we go and expose you to some different occupations? And again, in terms of how vocational education could work, it's one thing to say you're 13, you're a plumber, that's your choice. There's no reason why you couldn't go and say, look, here's 20 different jobs we're going to expose you to. 20 different realistic employment opportunities. I mean, the way that I see the system that we have is it's one where we expose people to a bunch of different careers that almost no one will ever have. So you go to high school, well, maybe you'll be a poet, or a novelist, or a composer, or a professional athlete, or an historian. Right? And these are, look, it's great to have some variety, but give people some variety that might actually work out for them instead of just a bunch of pipe dreams.
So I want to go a little bit, Rick, to your bailiwick of teacher value-added scores. So, and perhaps you can communicate this more efficiently than I can, but value-added scores are the independent contribution of a teacher has on students, and sometimes a teacher has more added to students' learning, and there are other teachers that have less. And so I'm going to ask you both to think about teacher value-added, not only for test scores, but also for later life outcomes. How does that fit with your 80-20 split, and Bryan, for your 20-80 split? And I'll let either of you take.
My 80-20 split first. I mean, what we know is that schools have highly differential impacts on students, and that the measured outcomes of those differential impacts pay off in the labor market and have downstream economic implications. And so that bolsters two parts of the argument that I would make, and that is that schools do have an impact on producing skills, and here we observe differences in skills. And secondly, that the part of the income distribution reflects directly skills that people have.
Yeah, so in part here, I'm totally on the same page as Rick, which is I think value added is a great way of measuring whether teachers are actually teaching students how to read and write and do math. And again, that's the part of school that I'm happy to admit is useful when it occurs. It doesn't occur nearly as often as it should. Now, in terms of the specific research, there's something very odd about it if you read it closely, which is, so it's true that Chetty does find that if you go and get a good teacher, and this will then go and boost your scores on the end of year tests, and you eventually make more money. Here's the weird thing. The students who get these good teachers, within 2 or 3 years, usually their test scores are back to normal. There's basically complete fade out in their cognitive skills, which if I were Rick, I'd be very confused by. So as to what's going on, why is it that if you get a good teacher, you learn more, you forget it, but then you get paid more a decade later? And again, I think the best story here is that having a good teacher is kind of like having an SAT prep class. It doesn't actually make you a permanently better person, but it does allow you to do well on the crucial thresholds that ration access to college and other measures of status. So I think that's the best story. Now, the one other thing about the magnitudes of these effects, how big are the benefits that Chetty actually even finds? The answer is he gets these big numbers by multiplying them by all the kids in the class times all the years of their career. All right, that may be fine for deciding whether it's a good idea to fire a bad teacher. But if you want to find out how much of the individual's benefit to education comes from a good teacher, actually Chetty's own numbers imply a very small change. It's just that it becomes big when you multiply it by 1,200.
I have one last question, and we only have...
Careers are long, and so obviously you have to judge both all of the students that a teacher has and the length of careers. I don't understand why you don't want to multiply by the right thing.
I mean, again, in terms of finding out what percentage of the annual increase in the kids' earnings can be explained by having good teachers, it's a small amount. It's true that you want to find out the total benefit, then you want to multiply by their whole life, but you don't want to go and say, if you get a better teacher for 30 kids, this means that it was a huge benefit for each one. And again, this is the way that people often misinterpret the paper. I'm not saying you wouldn't. Of course you wouldn't. You do it just right.
So my last question has to be, again, the motion is the education system is a waste of time and money. So an important question is, what could we be saving, right? Well, what is the opportunity cost that we're giving up here? So before we go to closing statements, what's our opportunity cost?
Imagine a world where you could get a good job right out of high school. Wouldn't that be better for almost everybody? That's the world we used to have. And again, the main change in the modern economy is not that jobs are much more intellectually demanding. That is a small part of the story. It's high-tech sectors. Most of what has occurred is that for one and the same job, to be a waiter, to deliver mail, to go and be a hotel concierge, you now need a lot more education than you did in the past. And what's the point? Wouldn't it be better if for all these jobs that have barely changed, the required education had stayed the same? This way people could start their lives at a much earlier age. People could be earning money instead of being dependent upon their parents. This is nice for both parents and kids, by the way, right? So, for kids to actually be independent adults at an earlier age, right? And then on top of it, there are hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars that could be saved. Just one thing I was a little puzzled by is Rick's own work says that input-based education doesn't really pay off. Pouring more resources into schools doesn't seem to yield much improvement in test scores. So then it seems like he too should be willing to admit that we could do massive cuts without actually even hurting skill acquisition. So that's the opportunity cost. Think of all the other things we could be doing with that money, right? And again, especially in a country where, given the way that budgets are shaping up, it looks like a financial crisis is going to come in maybe 20 years. Right? So, like with taxes and spending being what they are, it looks like we really need to start looking for ways to save some money. And how about we start saving it by cutting spending on stuff that barely affects student skills, and of course the students themselves often are quite miserable receiving.
Rick, last word before closing statements.
I agree that we have lots of inefficiency in the system, that we do not get as much as we should from the spending. What I don't understand is the alternative world. Right now I can point to and have some evidence on things that lead to inefficiencies. I don't know what cutting the spending on schools means. Does it mean, particularly since it starts in K to 12, should we have larger class sizes? Should we have cheaper teachers? Or should we just keep kids out of school? I don't understand how you get those savings. I do understand and have, as czar, lots of ideas on how to improve the use of our funding, but I don't think it's symmetric that we just say, cut the budget. Congress, well, it doesn't cut any budgets. If it cut the budgets, then we'd be equally as well off because we know there's a lot of waste. That doesn't mean that you're cutting the waste.
Well, I'm afraid I have to bring the conversation to an end for closing statements. So 2 minutes each, and Bryan, I think you're leading us off. And then we will vote again.
Sounds good.
Let me add that the voting will not be live or available until the end of closing statements, so don't jump the gun.
All right, now let me end with a disgusting example. All right, suppose you've got severe toenail fungus, and then a friend of yours comes and says, hey, I've got a stack of FDA studies, all of which say that the remedy that you are using does not work. And you say, well, what does work? And he says, well, it's really hard. I mean, it's a really hard problem to fix, and there's a bunch of things, but yeah, the evidence on this isn't very good either. I don't really know how to cure your toenail fungus, sorry. And then you say, well, I'm going to keep using what I've got until you come up with a cure. All right, this does not make sense. All right, if there is hard evidence that something is a waste of money, common sense says stop now, post haste, without delay, no excuses. Just stop doing it, right? And then, once you have stopped wasting money, then you can do a leisurely, open-minded review of the evidence to see if there's actually something else that would be a better use of your money. And maybe at the end you're going to say, look, this is just insoluble and we'd be better off going and spending my toenail fungus cure on a trip to Miami. All right. All right. This is, I think, very much the position that we are in with education. We see an enormous amount of waste, right? And yet, when you point out it's really wasteful, even when you are a world-famous researcher who has a great paper showing all the ways in which spending money doesn't actually seem to pay off, there is so much resistance to the idea of just, let's cut spending. Like, it doesn't seem like we're getting our money's worth. And there's this desire, look, we can't just cut. We have to cut and replace. You say, yeah, but the replacing is so hard, right? And again, especially, of course, in the real world, it's not just a matter of you figuring out what would be a good idea. I think Rick actually has a bunch of very good ways of improving schools. He's thought about it a lot. But the problem is the real world generally doesn't listen to him, right? Why not? Because he makes too much sense, right? You know, I just imagine going to the parents at my kids' schools and saying, look, we're going to stop worrying about all this touchy-feely stuff, and we're going to go and raise test scores because test scores are what really matters. People need reading, they need writing, they need math, they need real hard skills, and this is important for your kid, this is important for our country. If you want to make that case, it would just be back to the same touchy-feely stuff that drove me to start homeschooling my older kids. Namely, it's like, oh, but we don't want to be so narrow and it's so boring, and we want kids to explore and expand. It's like, well, how about they just learn to read and write? Wouldn't that be good? Oh, well, we can do it all. No, you can't. You aren't doing it, right? And it's like arguing with a brick wall. So this is where I say, look, let's do something that we know will work. It will save money. It will save time. Let's do it. And if there's some better way, let's figure that out after we have started with the obvious. Thank you.
So dressing up the idea of improving our schools and spending our money better with calling it signaling strikes me as just a red herring. We have lots of reasons why we are not spending effectively. The main reason, if I look at K-12 education, is that there's no relationship between what we pay teachers and their effectiveness in the classroom. That comes from institutional requirements. So now tell me what just spend less means. What does just spend less mean? Do we cut the base salary of all teachers across the board? Is that what spend less means? And we get the same outcome? Well, we probably wouldn't get the same outcome, but that's, I don't even understand what that means. I am for, in fact, improving the schools. But I think that when we look at the economic impact of higher quality learning and knowledge on individuals and the economy, we have to conclude that this is a good investment, even if we're doing a crummy job at it. And that we can, in fact, improve how we do that, but it doesn't mean that we throw it away. Now, Bryan Caplan, homeschooling parent, presumably didn't stop at the end of solving two equation systems, teaching math to his kids, because he realizes that he can influence the skills that his kids have more than just getting them into UC Berkeley, and that has an impact.
All right. All right, I'd like to thank our debaters again. Bryan Caplan and Eric Hanushek. Now it is time to determine who is the winner, whether you will vote on the motion. The education system is a waste of time and money. So please now, again, those in the audience here, please follow the instructions just as you did, the exact same instructions before. For those who are on the web, please go to slido.com, that's SLIDO, and I want you to enter the code AEI online and submit your answer. You have 3 minutes from now to submit your response. While you're voting, just a little bit of housekeeping. Ignore me if you're in the midst of a tough decision. Out in the hall after the debate, just here in a few minutes, there are copies of both Endangering Prosperity by Dr. Hanushek and The Case Against Education available for purchase. And if you are very clever, you may be able to get a signature on one or the other. And I appreciate the presence of the audience. Again, you have about 1 minute before we lock down voting.
People have been injured doing what?
It is a tricky stage indeed. Okay, and we will lock down the voting in 10 seconds. Okay, so I will announce this. This is live as it's coming in, so you'll have to give a moment for the finals. Let me first let you know what the initial polling results were. In the live audience here, the votes on the motion, the education system is a waste of time and money, 18% of you agreed, 58% disagreed, and 23% of the present audience were undecided. So I'm still waiting to get the results. I will say that with only 18% agreeing, there's some advantage to Dr. Caplan for more room to grow. Thus is the danger in taking a tough position. I hate to keep you in suspense. I promise I will tell you as soon as I get the numbers.
Nat, we should also vote on how many think that I should be czar, which is an idea that it's growing on me.
We do not vote on czar.
The final results that we have, the initial poll, 18% of the audience agreed with the motion. The final result was 27% agreed with the motion. So that is the number to beat, plus 9 change. 58% originally disagreed with the motion, and that number shifted to 53%, a decline of 5 points. Dr. Caplan is the winner of the debate. Let's applaud our excellent debaters.
Yes, we should have value added measure for this. I think we do. Yeah.